The winter of 1882 came to Montana Territory like a creditor collecting debts, relentless, merciless, and immune to negotiation. Snow fell in sheets so thick that the boundary between earth and sky dissolved into a single gray void. In this unforgiving landscape, where survival was the only currency that mattered, Caleb Rourke had built an empire that stretched farther than most men's dreams could reach. The Rourke Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, bordered by the Missouri River to the east and the Rocky Mountain foothills to the west. 500 head of cattle bore his brand, a simple R inside a circle, burned deep. 36 hands worked his land, their loyalty purchased not with warmth, but with fair wages paid on time, every time. In a territory where a man's word meant more than any written contract, Caleb's word was iron. The ranch house itself stood as a testament to his success. A 2-story structure of hewn logs and imported glass windows, massive stone chimneys at each end pumping smoke into the perpetual gray sky. Inside, luxuries that would make a San Francisco socialite envious, Persian rugs on polished wood floors, a piano shipped from Boston, leather-bound books lining shelves in a study warmed by a fireplace large enough to roast a whole steer. But for all its grandeur, the house felt like a mausoleum. Caleb stood at the window of his study on this particular February morning, watching the latest storm roll in from the northwest. At 38 years old, he cut an imposing figure, 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and bone, hardened by 2 decades of frontier life. His dark hair, shot through with premature gray at the temples, framed a face that seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could crack walnuts, and eyes the color of slate. Eyes that had learned long ago not to reveal what lay behind them. He wore his wealth with the casual indifference of a man who'd earned every penny himself. Tailored wool trousers, a silk vest the color of burgundy wine, a white shirt with sleeves rolled to reveal forearms roped with muscle. A gold watch chain hung across his vest, the timepiece itself a gift he'd bought for himself on his 35th birthday, because there was no one else to buy it for him. Behind him, the study door opened without a knock. Only one man in the territory would dare such familiarity. "They're coming up the road," said Thomas Gray, Caleb's foreman and the closest thing he had to a friend. Gray was a decade older, weather-beaten and bow-legged from 40 years in the saddle, with a gray beard that couldn't quite hide the scar running from his left ear to his chin, a souvenir from a knife fight in Deadwood that he never talked about. Caleb didn't turn from the window. "How many this time?" 4 riders, fancy carriage pulled by a team that cost more than most men make in a year. Gray's voice carried a mixture of amusement and disgust. "The Ashford family, if the crest on the door is any indication." "Boston money," Caleb said flatly. "Boston money trying to buy Montana land through Montana marriage," Gray confirmed. "3rd family this month. You want me to turn them away at the gate?" "No." Caleb finally turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Let's see what they're offering this time. Might be entertaining." Gray raised an eyebrow. "You're in a peculiar mood." "I'm always in the same mood, Thomas." "Exactly. That's what's peculiar." 20 minutes later, Caleb sat behind the massive oak desk in his study, fingers steepled, face arranged in an expression of polite attention that revealed absolutely nothing. Across from him, Marcus Ashford held court like a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. Ashford was everything Caleb despised about Eastern money: soft hands, softer morals, and the absolute conviction that everything and everyone had a price. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most Montana families earned in 6 months, and his cologne fought a losing battle with the honest smell of wood smoke and leather that permeated the ranch house. "You've built quite an operation here, Mr. Rourke," Ashford was saying, his eyes constantly appraising, calculating. "Quite impressive for a man who started with nothing." "I started with 2 hands and a willingness to use them," Caleb replied evenly. "Still have both." Ashford laughed, though his eyes didn't. "Indeed, the frontier rewards such men. But there comes a time when even the most self-made man must think about legacy, about heirs, about the future of everything he's built." "Here it comes," Caleb thought. "I have 3 daughters," Ashford continued, right on schedule. Beautiful, educated, accomplished young women. The eldest, Caroline, has expressed quite an interest in frontier life. She paints, watercolors. She's been inspired by the landscapes here. How nice for her, Caleb said. She's in the parlor now, if you'd care to meet her. 23 years old, speaks 4 languages, trained in music and literature at the finest schools. Mr. Ashford, Caleb interrupted, his voice still polite but carrying an edge that could cut glass. Let me save us both some time. You rode a long way in a bad storm to offer me your daughter like she's a prized heifer at auction. I appreciate the entrepreneurial spirit, but I'm not buying. The color drained from Ashford's face, then flooded back as crimson rage. How dare you? In fact, Caleb continued, rising to his feet with a fluid grace that somehow made the movement threatening, you're the 3rd man this month to make essentially the same offer. The Worthingtons came 2 weeks ago with their daughter Penelope. The Harringtons before that with their twins, which I thought showed either remarkable optimism or a fundamental misunderstanding of how marriage works. Before that, Mr. Rourke, Ashford sputtered, I came here in good faith. You came here, Caleb said quietly, and the quiet was more dangerous than shouting. Because you heard about a rich bachelor in Montana who might be stupid enough to trade his fortune for a wife he doesn't want and doesn't need. You came here with a daughter you've probably promised to 5 different men, hoping I'd be desperate enough or lonely enough to bite. Caleb walked around the desk, his movements controlled, predatory. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I built this ranch with my own blood and sweat. I fought drought, disease, blizzards, Blackfoot raiders, cattle rustlers, and every other damn thing this territory could throw at me. I've buried friends, killed men who needed killing, and made decisions that would give you nightmares. And you think I need a 23-year-old girl who paints watercolors to make my life complete? Ashford had gone pale again. Behind him, Thomas Gray stood by the door, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip, a reminder that in Montana, Eastern manners only went so far. Thomas will show you out, Caleb said. Safe travels back to Boston. You're making a mistake, Ashford managed, trying to salvage some dignity. A man alone is vulnerable. You need... What I need, Caleb said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is for you to get off my land before I lose what's left of my patience. And Mr. Ashford, when you get back to whatever gentleman's club you belong to, tell your friends to stop sending their daughters west. I'm not interested. Not now. Not ever. The door closed behind the Ashfords with a decisive thud. Gray returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. That was about as diplomatic as a gut punch, he observed. Caleb poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk. Was I unclear? Clear as mountain ice, also about as warm. Gray dropped into the chair Ashford had vacated. You know they'll just keep coming. Word spread from here to New York about the rich hermit of Montana. Every family with an unmarried daughter and declining fortunes sees you as their salvation. Then they'll keep being disappointed. Caleb drained the whiskey in one swallow. Caleb, Gray's voice softened in a way it rarely did. It's been 12 years. I know how long it's been. Miranda's gone. She's not coming back. And what she did is none of your concern. The words came out sharp enough to draw blood. Gray held up his hands in surrender. Fine, but dying alone out of spite isn't much of a victory. I'm not dying alone out of spite. Caleb poured another whiskey. I'm living alone out of preference. There's a difference. After Gray left, Caleb stood at the window again, watching the storm intensify. Snow now fell so thick he could barely see the barn 50 yards away. The ranch would be locked in for days, maybe a week. Fine. He had everything he needed right here. Food, whiskey, books, and solitude. The truth was, he'd gotten good at solitude. Better than good. He'd perfected it, turned it into an art form. In 12 years, he'd built walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate them. No smiling daughter of wealthy families, no well-meaning friends, no emotions that might make him vulnerable again. He'd learned his lesson, learned it in blood and betrayal on a spring morning in 1870 when he discovered that the woman he loved, the woman he'd trusted with everything, had sold him out to his competitors, stolen half his savings, and disappeared with a railroad man heading east. Miranda Colchester. Beautiful, brilliant, and utterly mercenary. She'd played him like a fiddle, and he danced to every note. Never again. The whiskey burned going down, but not as much as the memory. He'd been 26 then, still soft in ways that mattered, still capable of trust, still fool enough to believe that love was something real, something that couldn't be bought or sold. Miranda had cured him of that delusion. He'd rebuilt after she left. Rebuilt bigger, stronger, richer. Every cow he bought, every acre he claimed, every dollar he earned was another brick in the wall between him and the world. The ranch became his fortress, success became his armor, and loneliness became the price he paid for never being vulnerable again. It was a price he'd learned to live with. The days after the Ashfords' visit passed in the monotonous rhythm of winter ranch work. Cattle had to be fed, water sources kept from freezing, fences checked and repaired before the next storm. Caleb threw himself into the work with the same intensity he brought to everything, total focus, no room for thoughts that didn't serve a purpose. But the nights were harder. In the vast silence of the ranch house, with only the crackling fire and howling wind for company, the walls he'd built seemed less solid. The books he read didn't hold his attention. The whiskey didn't warm him the way it used to. And the dreams that came in the small hours before dawn were filled with a face he thought he'd forgotten. Not Miranda's face, that he'd successfully banished years ago. No, these dreams showed him something worse. A future of endless winters, endless solitude, endless silence. He saw himself at 50, at 60, still standing at this window, still watching storms roll in, still alone, wealthy beyond measure and poor in every way that mattered. He woke from these dreams in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and told himself he was fine. He had everything a man could want, everything he'd worked for. The loneliness was just weakness trying to creep back in. He wouldn't allow it. On the 7th day after the Ashfords' visit, Thomas Gray burst into Caleb's study without knocking, his face flushed from the cold. "Someone's coming up the road," he announced. Caleb didn't look up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Turn them away." "Caleb, you should see this." Something in Gray's tone made Caleb raise his head. "Another daughter?" "I don't think so. This one rode alone. No carriage, no entourage. Just a woman on a horse that's seen better days, wearing clothes that probably haven't been new in 5 years." "Alone? In this weather?" "Alone," Gray confirmed. "And she didn't come to the front door. She went straight to the barn. Asked my nephew if she could stable her horse out of the storm. Paid him 50 cents for hay and water." That was unusual enough to pique Caleb's curiosity. The wealthy families who came courting never paid for anything. They expected frontier hospitality as their due, and they certainly never handled their own horses. "Where is she now?" "Waiting by the kitchen door. Says she'd like to speak with you if you have time, but she'll understand if you're busy. Polite as Sunday church, but there's something in her eyes." Gray trailed off, searching for words. "She's not like the others." Against his better judgment, Caleb found himself curious. "Fine. Show her to the study." "You want me to stay?" "You think I need protection from one woman?" Gray's expression was unreadable. "I think you need protection from yourself, but I'll wait outside." Caleb positioned himself behind his desk, arranging his features into the same neutral mask he'd worn for the Ashfords. He expected another variation on the same theme, a different approach perhaps, but ultimately the same goal. Money, land, security. Everyone wanted something. The study door opened, and everything Caleb thought he knew shattered like ice under a hammer. She wasn't beautiful. Not in the way the paraded daughters had been beautiful, with their porcelain skin and elaborate hairstyles and dresses that cost more than a working man's yearly wage. This woman was something else entirely. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, slender but not fragile, the kind of lean that came from hard work and harder times. Her dark hair, somewhere between brown and black, was pulled back in a simple braid that hung over one shoulder. Her face was angular, almost severe, with high cheekbones and a jaw that suggested stubbornness. Weather had tanned her skin to a warm brown that no proper lady would ever allow. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were the color of amber, flecked with gold, and they held a lifetime of experience that no 23-year-old watercolor painter could possibly possess. These were eyes that had seen things, done things, survived things. They met his directly, without coyness or calculation, and he felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the ice he'd spent 12 years freezing solid. "Mr. Rourke," she said, and her voice was low, steady, with a hint of the South softened by years elsewhere. Thank you for seeing me. I'm Eliza Hart. She didn't curtsy, didn't simper, didn't do any of the things the other women had done. She just stood there, direct and unadorned, in a wool coat that had been mended in 3 visible places and boots that had walked a lot of hard miles. Caleb realized he was staring. He cleared his throat. Miss Hart, you rode alone in this weather? Mrs. Hart, she corrected gently. And yes, my horse and I have been through worse. Mrs. Hart, married, or had been. The title didn't match the lack of a ring on her left hand, which was bare except for calluses and old scars. Please, sit. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and she moved with a quiet grace that suggested careful economy of motion. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, and waited. She didn't launch into a prepared speech, didn't bat her eyes or laugh at nothing or any of the other theatrics he'd endured. She just waited, patient as stone. The silence stretched. Caleb, who usually wielded silence like a weapon, found himself unsettled by it. Finally, he spoke. What brings you to my ranch, Mrs. Hart? Honesty, she said simply. He blinked. I'm sorry? You asked what brought me here. The answer is honesty, or rather, the lack of it in every other interaction you've had recently. She leaned forward slightly, those amber eyes never leaving his. I heard about you in town. The rich rancher who keeps turning away wealthy suitors. The man no one can reach. The fortress no one can breach. And you thought you'd try your luck? His voice carried an edge of cynicism. No, she shook her head. I thought I'd try the truth instead. Which is? That you're not looking for a wife. You're looking for a reason to believe that love isn't just another business transaction. And you won't find it in the parade of women whose fathers are offering them like livestock. The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb felt his carefully constructed defenses crack a little wider. You presume to know what I'm looking for? He tried to make it sound dismissive, but it came out curious instead. I know what loneliness looks like, Mr. Rourke. I've seen it in the mirror every morning for the past 3 years. She didn't flinch from the admission, didn't dress it up in prettier words. I know what it's like to build walls so high you can't remember what they're protecting. And I know what it's like to realize that safety and solitude aren't the same thing. Silence filled the study again, but this time it felt different, charged, dangerous. Why are you here? Caleb asked quietly. Really? Eliza took a slow breath, and for the first time he saw something vulnerable flicker across her face. Because I'm tired of being alone. And because I saw in your story something that matched my own. Not the money or the land or the success. I have none of those things. But the walls, the fear, the certainty that trusting anyone again would be suicide. She met his eyes. I came here to see if I was right, and to see if maybe, just maybe, 2 people tired of being fortresses might find something better together. You're very direct, Caleb managed. I'm too old and too tired for anything else. How old? 32. She looked younger, or maybe older, or maybe she just looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd lived hard and survived harder. Tell me your story, Caleb heard himself say. He hadn't meant to ask, hadn't meant to engage, but something about her pulled the words out of him. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, and her words painted a picture of a life that made his own hardships seem trivial by comparison. She'd been born in Georgia, the daughter of a schoolteacher who died when she was 7. Her mother had remarried quickly, had to survive. But the stepfather who came with that survival was a man whose hands were quick to anger and whose words cut deeper than any whip. She'd escaped at 16 by marrying a boy from church, a blacksmith's apprentice who promised her safety and a new start. Robert was kind for the first year, she said, her voice steady but distant, like she was reading from someone else's history. Then the kindness started cracking. First just words, then hands, then worse. She didn't elaborate on worse. She didn't need to. Caleb had seen enough in his years to fill in the gaps. I left him after 5 years. Took nothing but the clothes I wore and the horse he'd bought but never rode. I knew he'd come after me if he found me, so I kept moving. Georgia to Tennessee, Tennessee to Arkansas, Arkansas to Texas. then north through Kansas and Nebraska until I ended up here. Why Montana? Caleb asked. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Because it's as far as I could run, and because men like Robert don't do well in cold places. They need warmth to breed their particular kind of poison. You're not afraid he'll find you? Robert died 2 years ago, thrown from a horse, ironically. Broke his neck. She said it without emotion, without satisfaction, without anything at all. It was just a fact. I was free after that. Legally, anyway. But being legally free and being actually free are different things. Caleb understood that better than she knew. So you've been running for, what, over a decade? 13 years, she confirmed. Running first, then wandering. Working where I could, washing clothes, cooking, cleaning, mending, anything honest, anything that let me move on when I needed to. And now? Now she did smile, and it transformed her face completely. It wasn't a big smile, nothing theatrical, but it was real. The first genuine smile Caleb had seen in his study in years. Now I'm tired of running, tired of wandering, tired of being alone. She held his gaze. I don't want your money, Mr. Rourke. I don't want your land. I want conversation, understanding. Maybe, eventually, companionship. I want to see if two people who've learned all the wrong lessons about trust might teach each other better ones. That's quite a gamble, Caleb said. Living is a gamble. The question is whether you're betting on fear or hope. Outside, the storm howled against the windows. Inside, something infinitely more dangerous was building, a connection neither of them had planned for, wanted, or knew how to stop. Caleb should have ended it right there. Should have thanked her politely and sent her back to town. Should have reinforced his walls and returned to his safe, lonely empire. Instead, he heard himself say, "Stay for dinner." Eliza's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Rourke, the storm's getting worse. Your horse is sheltered. You've ridden hard to get here. The least I can do is feed you before you head back." He stood, moving toward the door. "Besides, you said you wanted conversation. Let's see if you're as interesting over a meal as you are in my study." She stood as well, graceful and cautious. "I don't want to impose." "If I thought you were imposing, you wouldn't still be here." He led her to the dining room, a space that rarely saw use. The table could seat 12 easily, carved from a single massive pine that had taken 8 men to move into place. Tonight, he had the cook, a gruff woman named Margaret, who'd followed him from his first lean-to shack to this mansion, set places at one end, close enough for conversation. Dinner was simple but good: venison stew, fresh bread, roasted potatoes, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They ate in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, and Caleb found himself studying this strange woman who'd crashed into his carefully ordered world. She ate like someone who'd known hunger, not rushed, but with a quiet appreciation for every bite. No prissy picking at food, no performance of delicate appetite, just honest eating. "Tell me about the ranch," she said eventually. "How did you build all this?" So he told her. Not the sanitized version he might give to business associates, but the real story. Starting with nothing at 19, working as a ranch hand for men who paid in whiskey and abuse. Learning every skill the hard way, saving every penny. Buying his first 100 acres with money that represented 2 years of near starvation. Building his herd 1 cow at a time, sometimes walking them 100 miles to better grazing. Fighting off rustlers, weather, disease, and his own doubts. And then Miranda. He hadn't meant to tell Eliza about Miranda, but somehow the story spilled out. The whirlwind courtship, the partnership they'd built, the betrayal that came when she took everything they'd created together and sold it to his competitors. "She left me broken," he finished. "I was 26 and stupid enough to believe that love was real." "It is real," Eliza said quietly. "Then why does everyone treat it like currency?" "Because some people confuse love with need, or want, or fear." She set down her fork. "Real love doesn't demand anything. It doesn't need contracts or guarantees. It's just choosing to face life beside someone instead of alone." Sounds like a fairy tale. Sounds like a risk. She met his eyes. "But you're a gambling man, Mr. Rourke. You bet on yourself when you had nothing. You bet on this land when everyone said it was impossible. You built an empire on risk, Why is betting on another person any different? Because land doesn't lie to you. Cattle don't betray you. Money doesn't pretend to be something it's not. No, she agreed. They just leave you alone in a house big enough for 12 people, eating dinner with a stranger because it's the first real conversation you've had in years. The truth of it hit him like a fist to the gut. He wanted to be angry at her presumption, but he couldn't. Because she was right. They talked until the candles burned low and the coffee pot was empty. They talked about books. She'd read more than most educated men, taught herself from borrowed volumes during her years of wandering. They talked about the land, the brutal beauty of Montana winters, the strange isolation of frontier life. They talked about everything and nothing, and somewhere in the conversation, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 12 years. He felt seen, not as a wealthy rancher or a potential husband or a fortress to be conquered, just as himself, just as Caleb, a man with scars and stories and a loneliness he'd tried to bury under success. When the clock struck 10, Eliza stood. I should go. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. The storm's worse, Caleb said, and it was true. Wind rattled the windows like it was trying to break in. You won't make it back to town tonight. I've ridden in worse. Maybe. He stood as well. But there's no reason to risk it. I have a guest room that hasn't been used in years. Stay the night, head back when the weather clears. She hesitated, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. Propriety versus practicality, reputation versus survival. Separate room, he clarified. Separate wing of the house, actually. Thomas Gray and his wife have quarters here, too. You'll be properly chaperoned. I wasn't worried about my reputation, Mr. Rourke. I stopped caring what people thought when I left Georgia. She smiled that small, real smile again. I was worried about yours. I stopped caring what people thought when I sent the Harrington twins packing. Fair enough. He showed her to the guest room himself, a comfortable space with a fireplace already lit, clean linens, and a window that looked out over the valley. She stood in the doorway, studying the room like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Thank you, she said simply. For dinner, for conversation, for not treating me like every other woman who's knocked on your door. You're not like every other woman who's knocked on my door. No? She agreed. I'm worse. I'm honest. After she closed the door, Caleb returned to his study and poured himself a whiskey. His hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly. Not from fear, from something else, something he couldn't name. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the fortress he'd built was developing cracks he couldn't seal, and the most terrifying part was that he wasn't sure he wanted to. The storm broke 3 days later, leaving the world transformed under a crystalline blanket of white that stretched to the horizon. Eliza had stayed through it all, not by Caleb's insistence, but by simple practicality. The roads were impassable, the wind temperatures lethal. But what had begun as necessity had become something neither of them could name. Each morning, Caleb found her in the kitchen before dawn, helping Margaret prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. Each evening, they sat across from each other in the dining room, talking until the candles guttered and died. And in between, she moved through his house like a ghost made solid, quiet, and unobtrusive, but somehow making the vast empty spaces feel less hollow. On the fourth morning, Caleb woke to find her standing in his study, looking at the books on his shelves. She hadn't heard him approach, and he watched her for a moment, noting the way her fingers traced the spines with something approaching reverence. You can borrow any you like, he said. She turned, not startled. She had the instincts of someone who'd learned never to be caught off guard. I wasn't snooping. I didn't think you were. He moved into the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. I thought you might be looking for something to read. I was looking at what you read, she corrected. You can tell a lot about a person from their library. These aren't just for show. The spines are cracked, the pages worn. You've actually read them. Is that surprising? Most wealthy men collect books like they collect everything else, as proof of something they want people to think they are. She pulled out a volume, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, and opened it to a page marked with a leather bookmark. But you've made notes in the margins. You've argued with these authors. You've thought about what they're saying. Caleb felt oddly exposed, like she'd seen something more intimate than if she'd caught him undressed. Philosophy helps pass the winter nights. Philosophy keeps you company when nothing else will, she said. And it wasn't a question. She replaced the book carefully. I do the same thing, except I can't afford to buy books, so I copy passages into a journal, carry the words with me. Do you have it? The journal? She nodded, and something vulnerable crossed her face. In my saddlebag. I've never shown it to anyone. I'd like to see it, Caleb said, if you're willing. She studied him for a long moment, those amber eyes searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she said, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. My what? Your margins, the arguments you've had with dead philosophers, the thoughts you've never spoken aloud. She smiled slightly. Fair trade? It was absurd. He'd known this woman for 4 days. 4 days shouldn't be enough time to trust someone with the private thoughts he'd scribbled in the lonely hours between midnight and dawn. But something about her steady gaze and unflinching honesty made the absurdity feel like sense. Fair trade, he agreed. They spent the morning in the study, trading books and journals like children trading treasures. Caleb read her careful handwriting, passages from Emerson and Thoreau, from Shakespeare and Milton, copied out with a steady hand and annotated with observations that cut straight to the bone. She read his arguments with Plato about the nature of truth, his marginalia challenging Aristotle on virtue, his underlined passages in Dante about the geography of hell. You don't trust easy answers, she observed, looking up from a particularly dense argument he'd written about the nature of justice. Easy answers are usually wrong. And hard answers are usually incomplete. He set down her journal carefully, but at least they're honest about their limitations. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, What happened to you, Caleb? I don't mean Miranda, I mean before her. What made you someone who sees the world as a puzzle that can't be solved? No one had ever asked him that before. Not Thomas Gray, not the few friends he'd allowed past his outer defenses, not even Miranda in their brief doomed partnership. Everyone assumed he'd been born cynical, carved from granite with a heart of ice. But Eliza was asking something different. She was asking about the man before the walls, before the armor, before the calculated distance he kept between himself and everything that could hurt him. My father, he said finally, the words coming slow and heavy. He was a dreamer, believed in the goodness of people, the fairness of the world, the idea that hard work and honesty would be rewarded. He worked himself to death building a farm in Ohio, trusting the neighbors who promised to help, believing the merchants who said they'd give him fair prices, counting on the bank that said they'd extend his credit. Caleb stood, walking to the window, unable to look at her while he spoke. They lied. All of them. The neighbors took his best land when he couldn't defend it. The merchants cheated him. The bank foreclosed. He died at 42, broken and bewildered, still trying to understand why the world didn't work the way he thought it should. How old were you? 17, old enough to bury him, old enough to understand that his greatest weakness wasn't lack of strength or intelligence. It was trust. He trusted people to be better than they were. Caleb's voice hardened. I learned from his mistake. I learned that the only person you can trust is yourself. That trust is a luxury that gets you killed or broken or buried in an unmarked grave. He heard her move behind him, felt her presence at his shoulder. She didn't touch him, didn't offer empty comfort, just stood there in the kind of companionable silence that acknowledged pain without trying to fix it. My mother taught me something similar, Eliza said quietly. Trust the wrong person, and you'll spend your life paying for it. So I learned to trust no one. Married Robert because he seemed safe, only to discover that safe and trustworthy aren't the same thing. Ran for 13 years because staying still meant being vulnerable. Built walls so high I couldn't see over them anymore. And now? Caleb asked. Now I'm standing in a stranger's house, showing him my journal, telling him things I've never told anyone. She paused. And I'm terrified. He turned to look at her then and saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. Two people who'd learned all the wrong lessons, standing at the edge of something that could destroy them both. We should stop this, he said. Whatever this is, you should leave when the road's clear. Go back to town, find work, start over somewhere else. This, he gestured between them. This is dangerous. Yes, she agreed. It is. Then why aren't you running? Because I'm tired of running away from things. Maybe it's time to run toward something instead. She met his gaze directly. But I can't do it alone. And I won't do it with someone who's not willing to risk the same thing I am. What are you risking? Everything, she said simply. My safety, my solitude, my carefully constructed defenses. The story I've told myself about who I am and what I'm capable of surviving. If I let you in and you break me, I don't know if I can rebuild again. I've done it too many times already. The honesty of it stole his breath. Most people dressed their vulnerability in prettier words, made their fear sound noble or romantic. But Eliza just laid it out plain. This is what I'm risking. This is what it costs me. This is what I'm afraid of. I could destroy you, Caleb said, and he meant it as a warning. I know, and I could destroy you right back. She didn't flinch. We're both carrying enough damage to ruin each other 6 ways from Sunday. The question is whether we're brave enough to try anyway. Before he could answer, Thomas Gray knocked on the study door. Caleb, we've got a problem. The moment shattered like ice. Caleb took a breath, pulling his professional mask back into place. What kind of problem? The kind with rifles, 4 men at the south gate demanding to speak with you. Gray's face was grim. They say they're from the Cattlemen's Association, but they're not here to talk about cattle. Caleb's blood went cold. The Cattlemen's Association was supposed to be a cooperative organization, ranchers banding together for mutual protection and fair prices. But in the past year, it had been taken over by men who saw cooperation as code for control. They wanted every rancher in the territory to join, pay dues, follow their rules, and they didn't take kindly to those who refused. Caleb had refused, loudly and publicly. How many guns? He asked. All of them are armed, and they've got that look, not here for conversation. Eliza's hand touched his arm, light as snow. What's happening? Nothing that concerns you. He moved toward the door, already calculating angles, exits, how many seconds it would take to reach the rifle cabinet. Thomas, get her upstairs. Lock the door. Like hell, Eliza said, her voice sharp. I'm not hiding while you walk into whatever this is. This isn't your fight. I'm standing in your house, eating your food, sleeping under your roof. Her eyes flashed. That makes it my fight whether you like it or not. There was no time to argue. Caleb grabbed a rifle from the cabinet, checked the load with practiced efficiency, and headed for the door. Behind him, he heard Eliza's quick footsteps and knew she was following despite his order. The 4 men waited in the yard, mounted on horses that steamed in the cold air. Their leader was a bull of a man named Jackson Crane, 50 years old and mean as a snake, with a reputation for solving problems with violence first and questions later. He owned a spread north of Caleb's land and had made no secret of his desire to expand. Roar, Crane called out, his breath fogging the air. We need to talk. Then talk, Caleb said, rifle held loose but ready. But do it from there. My property line ends at the gate. This is association business. We can do it easy or we can do it hard. Crane spat tobacco juice into the snow. Your choice. I'm not part of your association. Haven't been, won't be. So whatever business you think you have with me is based on a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Crane leaned forward in his saddle. Every rancher in this territory joins the association. That's how it works now. You join, you pay your dues, you follow the rules we all agreed to. I didn't agree to anything. That's the problem. One of the other riders, a younger man with a scar across his cheek, moved his horse forward. You think you're too good for the rest of us. Think you can operate outside the system. I think I can run my ranch however I damn well please, Caleb said, his voice level but carrying across the yard. Last I checked, this was still free territory. Free territory means wild territory, Crane said. Means rustlers and raiders and every kind of lawless element operating without consequences. The association brings order, protection, fairness. Funny how your version of fairness always seems to benefit you more than anyone else. Crane's face darkened. We came here respectful, Rourke, giving you one last chance to join voluntarily. But make no mistake, one way or another, you'll be part of this association, either as a member in good standing or as an example of what happens to those who refuse. The threat hung in the air, crystalline and sharp. Caleb felt his finger tighten on the rifle trigger, calculating odds. 4 against 1, except Thomas was somewhere behind him with a shotgun, and knowing Thomas, he'd positioned himself for a clear shot at Crane. You threatening me on my own land, Jackson? I'm explaining reality to you. Crane straightened in his saddle. You've got 1 week to reconsider. After that, well, accidents happen on the frontier. Fences get cut. Cattle wander off. Barns catch fire. Would be a shame if something happened to this beautiful ranch you've built. Before Caleb could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. You're awfully brave when it's 4 against 1, Eliza said, stepping out from behind Caleb. She held no weapon, but something in her bearing made the men shift in their saddles. I wonder how brave you'd be if the odds were even. Who the hell are you? Crane demanded. Someone who's seen enough bullies to recognize the breed. She walked forward, and Caleb's heart stopped. She was putting herself between him and 4 armed men. You dress it up and talk about associations and order and fairness, but what you're really doing is extortion. Join us or suffer the consequences. Pay us or we'll destroy you. That's not cooperation. That's cowardice with a committee. The young rider with the scar laughed. Listen to the lady lecture us. You Rourke's new whore? The words were barely out of his mouth before Caleb moved, rifle swinging up. Choose your next words very carefully. Easy, Rourke. Crane held up a hand, though his eyes were calculating. The boy speaks out of turn, but the lady should know better than to involve herself in men's business. The lady, Eliza said coldly, has survived things that would break every one of you. I've walked through fire and come out the other side. You think your threats scare me? You think I'm going to stand aside while you try to intimidate a good man into submission? Eliza, Caleb said quietly, urgently. Stop. She ignored him. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn those horses around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Mr. Rourke will continue to run his ranch as he sees fit, without interference from you or your association. And if you come back here making threats, you'll find out that he's not as alone as you think. That a fact? Crane's voice was dangerous now. And who's going to stand with him? You? Me, said Thomas Gray, stepping into view with his shotgun. And every man who works this ranch. And every honest rancher in the territory who's tired of your protection racket. We'll see about that. Crane gathered his reins. 1 week, Rourke. Think about what you're risking. Think about what you stand to lose. They rode off, and Caleb waited until they were out of rifle range before he allowed himself to breathe. Then he turned to Eliza, and the fear he'd been suppressing exploded into fury. What the hell were you thinking? His voice came out harsh, louder than he intended. You could have gotten yourself killed. I was thinking that you needed someone to stand with you. I needed you safe. I needed you upstairs, away from this. He was shouting now, all his careful control shattered. You think this is some kind of game? Those men would have shot you without blinking. I know exactly what they would have done, she shouted right back, matching his fury with her own. I've met men like them before. I've been threatened by men like them, hurt by men like them, and I'll be damned if I'm going to hide while another one tries to destroy someone She stopped abruptly, the unsaid word hanging between them like smoke. The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb stared at her, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with adrenaline and something else, something he couldn't name and didn't want to examine. Someone you what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza looked at him, and her eyes were fierce and vulnerable and terrified all at once. Someone I care about. Someone who matters. Someone worth standing up for, even if it's stupid and dangerous and completely insane. You've known me for 4 days. I know. It doesn't make sense. It shouldn't be possible. But here we are anyway. She took a shaking breath. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth because that's all I know how to do anymore. You matter to me, Caleb Rourke, and I'd rather die defending someone who matters than live safely defending no one at all. The words cracked something open inside him, something he'd kept locked and buried for 12 years. He wanted to push her away, wanted to rebuild his walls, wanted to protect himself from the terrifying possibility that she meant every word. Instead, he found himself stepping forward, closing the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face. Her skin was cold from the wind, but her eyes were warm, searching his for permission or denial or something he didn't know how to give. This is a mistake, he said. Probably, she agreed. We're going to destroy each other. Maybe. I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to trust someone again. Don't know how to be anything but alone. Neither do I. Her hands came up to cover his, and the touch sent electricity through every nerve. So we'll figure it out together, or we'll crash and burn trying. But at least we won't be alone when we do. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the careful, calculated kisses he'd shared with Miranda all those years ago. This was desperate and honest and terrifying. Two people falling off a cliff together and hoping there was something to catch them at the bottom. She kissed him back with equal desperation, her hands fisting in his shirt. And for a moment the world contracted to just this, her mouth on his, her breath mixing with his, her heartbeat racing against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words torn from someplace deep. "I'm so scared of what you could do to me." "I know," she whispered. "I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay." That night they sat in the study again, but everything had changed. The distance Caleb had carefully maintained was gone, replaced by a proximity that felt both natural and completely foreign. Eliza sat in the chair beside him instead of across from him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, smell the faint scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her skin. "Tell me the rest," she said quietly. "Tell me what Miranda did. The parts you left out." He didn't want to. Didn't want to relive the worst moment of his life. The moment when he'd discovered that everything he believed about love and trust and partnership was a lie. But Eliza had shown him her scars, the ones he could see and the ones she'd described. He owed her the same honesty. "We were going to expand," he said, staring into the fire. "Buy another 1,000 acres, double the herd, build something that would last generations. I'd saved for 2 years, worked every hour there was, scraped together enough capital to make it happen. Miranda handled the books, the negotiations, the paperwork. I trusted her completely." His hands clenched on the arms of the chair. "One morning, I woke up and she was gone. No note, no explanation. Just gone. It took me 3 days to realize she'd taken the money, all of it, every penny I'd saved. And she'd sold information about my operation to the Brennan brothers, my biggest competitors. Told them which land I was planning to buy, which contracts I was negotiating, which suppliers I was working with. They used it to undercut me at every turn." "How did you survive?" "Barely. I had to start over from almost nothing. Took out loans that should have buried me, worked jobs I'd sworn I'd never work again, fought off the Brennans and half a dozen other vultures who thought I was finished." The memory still tasted like ash. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was knowing that every moment we'd shared, every conversation, every kiss, every promise, it was all a performance. She never loved me. She was just positioning herself for the perfect moment to strike. "Did you ever find her?" "No, and I stopped looking after a year. What would I have done if I'd found her? Killed her? Begged her to come back?" Neither option would have changed what happened. He finally looked at Eliza. "So I buried it. Built walls so high that no one could ever get close enough to do that kind of damage again. And it worked. For 12 years, it worked perfectly." "Until I showed up," Eliza said softly. "Until you showed up," he agreed. "And now I don't know if I'm brave enough or stupid enough or desperate enough to try again." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady but gentle. "I can't promise I won't hurt you, Caleb. I can't promise this will work, or that we won't crash and burn spectacularly. I can't even promise I won't wake up tomorrow morning and panic and run, because that's what I've done for 13 years and old habits die hard." Not exactly a ringing endorsement. "But," she continued, ignoring his bitter humor, "I can promise honesty. I can promise that if I do hurt you, it won't be intentional. I can promise that I won't lie to you, won't manipulate you, won't use you for something you're not offering freely. And I can promise that I'm more terrified of this than you are, because at least you have this ranch, this land, this empire to fall back on. All I have is myself. If this breaks me, I have nothing to rebuild with." The vulnerability in her words cut straight through his defenses. She was right. He had safety nets she didn't. Money, land, a reputation that would survive heartbreak. She was risking everything on a man she'd known for 4 days, A man who'd spent 12 years proving he was incapable of trust. Why? He asked. Why take that risk? Because loneliness is a slow death, and I'm tired of dying. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. Her palm was calloused, her fingers scarred from hard work, but her touch was gentle. Because when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it costs to survive. Someone who knows that strength isn't about never being hurt. It's about choosing to keep living even after you've been shattered. And because for the first time in 13 years, I don't want to run. I want to stay. And that terrifies me more than anything those men with rifles could have done. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his and hers, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the walls coming down, not yet, but maybe a door opening, maybe a window letting in light. Stay, he said. Not a command, a question, a plea. I'm here, she answered, for as long as you'll have me. They sat in the firelight, hands clasped, both of them trembling with fear and hope, and the terrible knowledge that they were choosing something far more dangerous than safety. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and cold and full of threats. Jackson Crane and his association, the bitter winter that still had months to run, the uncertain future that promised nothing but more hardship. But inside, two people who'd spent years building fortresses were taking the first terrifying steps toward tearing them down. It would be messy. It would hurt. And there was no guarantee they'd survive it. But for the first time in longer than either could remember, the loneliness didn't feel quite so crushing. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. The week that followed moved like a dream wrapped in barbed wire, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Eliza didn't leave. Every morning, Caleb expected to wake and find her gone, fled back to the safety of solitude and the familiar patterns of survival. But every morning she was there, moving through the ranch house with quiet purpose, carving out a space in his life without asking permission. She didn't try to change things. That was what surprised him most. The wealthy daughters who'd come courting had always arrived with lists, renovations they'd make, staff they'd hire, social events they'd host. They'd looked at his ranch house and seen a project, something to be civilized and transformed into their vision of what wealth should look like. Eliza looked at it and simply lived in it. She helped Margaret in the kitchen, not because she was trying to prove domestic capability, but because the work needed doing. She read his books and left them exactly where she'd found them. She sat in comfortable silence or engaged in conversations that stretched for hours, and she seemed content with either. But the threat from Jackson Crane hung over everything like a storm that hadn't yet broken. The week's deadline was approaching, and Caleb knew with absolute certainty that Crane wasn't bluffing. The Cattlemen's Association had already run 3 independent ranchers out of the territory in the past year. Their methods were brutal and effective: cut fences, poisoned water sources, stampeded herds, and if those subtleties didn't work, barns burned to the ground in the dead of night. On the 5th morning after Crane's visit, Thomas Gray found Caleb in the barn checking the horses. "We need to talk," Thomas said without preamble. Caleb didn't look up from the hoof he was examining. About? About what you're planning to do when Crane comes back. About whether you're going to join his damn association or stand your ground. And about whether you've thought through what standing your ground is going to cost. I've thought about it. Have you? Thomas's voice was sharp. Because from where I'm standing, you've been too busy courting Eliza Hart to think about the fact that you're about to start a range war. Caleb set the horse's hoof down carefully and straightened, meeting Thomas's eyes. Say what you mean. I mean, that woman is a distraction you can't afford right now. I mean that you're making decisions with your heart instead of your head for the first time in 12 years, and the timing couldn't be worse. Thomas's weathered face was tight with concern. I like Eliza. She's got spine, and she's honest, and she doesn't take any nonsense from anyone. But she's also making you vulnerable at the exact moment you need to be at your strongest. You think I should send her away? I think you need to decide what matters more, proving a point to Jackson Crane, or protecting someone who actually gives a damn about you. The words hit harder than Thomas probably intended. Caleb moved past him, walking out into the cold morning air, his breath fogging in the chill. Behind him, he heard Thomas follow. You think I haven't thought about this? Caleb said, staring out at the land he'd built from nothing. Every night I lie awake running scenarios. If I join the association, I'm admitting defeat. I'm letting Crane and his thugs dictate how I run my operation. I'm paying protection money to men who don't deserve it, and submitting to rules designed to benefit them at my expense. But you'd be safe, Thomas said quietly. You'd keep the ranch, keep everything you've built. Would I? Or would I just be delaying the inevitable? Caleb turned to face his foreman. Men like Crane are never satisfied with compliance. Today, it's association dues and following their rules. Tomorrow, it's selling my land at whatever price they decide is fair. Next year, it's watching them absorb everything I've worked for because I gave them the power to do it. So you'd rather fight? I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. The words came out harder than he intended. I built this place refusing to bow to anyone. I'm not starting now. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching Caleb's face. And Eliza? Where does she fit in this righteous stand you're planning? That was the question that had been eating at Caleb for days. Since their kiss, since that moment of terrifying honesty in the firelight, he'd felt something shift in his calculations. Before Eliza, the choice had been simple: fight or submit, win or lose, live or die. But now there was someone else to consider, someone who could be hurt by choices that had nothing to do with her. I don't know, he admitted. I've asked her to leave. She refuses. Of course she refuses. She's as stubborn as you are. Thomas shook his head. But stubborn doesn't stop bullets, Caleb. And when Crane comes back, and he will come back, he's not going to care that she's not part of this fight. He's going to use her as leverage. He's going to hurt you, and there won't be a damn thing you can do to stop it. The thought made Caleb's blood run cold. He'd seen what men like Crane did to women who got in their way. The frontier was full of stories: cabins burned with families inside, women disappeared and found weeks later, violations that no one spoke about but everyone knew. Then what do you suggest? Caleb asked, hearing the edge of desperation in his own voice. Send her to town, pay for a room at the boarding house, give her enough money to get her through the winter, keep her safe until this is settled one way or another. Thomas's voice gentled slightly. If you care about her, and I think you do, then you'll protect her by getting her as far from this mess as possible. She won't go. Make her go. Use that iron will of yours for something other than proving points to men who aren't worth the effort. Before Caleb could respond, he saw Eliza walking toward them from the house, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She moved with that economy of motion he'd come to recognize. Nothing wasted, every step deliberate. I'll leave you to it, Thomas said quietly, and headed toward the bunkhouse. Eliza reached Caleb, her amber eyes reading his face with unsettling accuracy. What did Thomas say? That I'm being reckless, that I'm putting you in danger, that I should send you away before Crane comes back. He met her gaze directly. He's right. About which part? All of it. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, weighing, calculating the same equations he'd been running for days. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. I'm not leaving. Eliza? No. The word was flat, final. I know what you're going to say, that this isn't my fight, that I could get hurt, that the smart thing would be to run. And you're right. It would be smart. It would be safe. And 6 months ago, I would have done exactly that without a second thought. Then why won't you now? Because I'm tired of being smart and safe. The passion in her voice surprised him. I've spent 13 years being smart and safe, running from every conflict, avoiding every risk, keeping myself so protected that I might as well have been dead. And where did it get me? Alone, wandering from town to town, working jobs that didn't matter, sleeping in rooms that weren't home, existing but not living. She stepped closer, and he could see the fire in her eyes now, the determination that had let her survive things that would have broken most people. You matter to me, Caleb. This place matters. What we're building here, whatever it is, matters more than safety. And if I run now, if I let fear make my decisions one more time, then I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it. I'll wonder what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. And I'm done wondering. You could die, he said bluntly. Crane doesn't make idle threats. When he comes back, it won't be to talk. It'll be to make an example. And anyone standing with me becomes a target. Then I'll be a target. She took his hands in hers, and he felt the calluses on her palms, the strength in her grip. I'd rather be a target standing beside you than safe and alone somewhere else. That's not rational. Love isn't rational. The words hung in the cold air between them, crystalline and irreversible. And yes, I said it. Love. I know it's too soon. I know it's insane. I know every logical argument against it. But there it is anyway. I love you, Caleb Rourke. I love your stubborn pride and your philosophical arguments and the way you've built something extraordinary out of nothing. I love that you're willing to fight for what's right, even when it's stupid. And I'll be damned if I'm going to abandon you right when things get hard. Caleb felt something break open inside him, something he'd kept locked and buried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely beyond his control. He pulled her close, kissing her with a desperation that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with the realization that he'd found something worth more than all the land and cattle and money in Montana. I love you too, he said against her mouth, the words torn from someplace deep. And that's why I'm terrified, because I know what men like Crane do to the things I love. They destroy them, and I can't. His voice broke. I can't lose you, not when I just found you. Then don't lose me. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. Fight with me, not for me. Trust me to be strong enough to stand beside you. Because I am, Caleb. I've survived worse than Jackson Crane, and I'll survive this too. We'll survive it together. The deadline came on the 7th day, arriving with a bitter wind that cut through layers of wool and leather like they were paper. Caleb spent the morning preparing, not for surrender, but for siege. He positioned his ranch hands at strategic points around the property, each man armed and ready. Thomas took up a position in the barn loft with a rifle that could drop a target at 300 yards. Caleb himself stood at the front of the house, Eliza beside him despite every argument he'd made to get her to stay inside. They came at noon, and this time there were more than 4. Jackson Crane rode at the head of a group of 12 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of men who'd done violence before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. They stopped at the property line, close enough to talk, but far enough to make a quick retreat if shooting started. "Your week is up, Rourke," Crane called out, his voice carrying across the frozen ground. "Time to make your choice. Join the association or face the consequences." "I made my choice a week ago," Caleb replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline singing through his veins. "My answer is no. Today, tomorrow, and every day after. I'm not joining your organization, I'm not paying your dues, and I'm not following your rules." "That's disappointing." Crane's smile was cold as the wind. "I was hoping you'd see reason, but if you want to do this the hard way, we're prepared to oblige." 12 against 1? Eliza's voice cut through the tension. "Those are cowards' odds." "Stay out of this, woman," one of the riders snarled. "Or what? You'll shoot an unarmed woman? That the kind of men you are?" She took a step forward, and Caleb's heart stopped. "You want to know what I think? I think you're all terrified. Terrified that if one rancher stands up to you and wins, others will follow. Terrified that your little protection racket will fall apart the moment someone calls your bluff." "This isn't a bluff," Crane said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "And you'd do well to remember that." "No, what this is," Eliza continued, and Caleb could hear 13 years of fury and survival channeled into her words, "is a group of weak men trying to feel strong by threatening someone who actually built something. You want what he has because you don't have the spine to build it yourselves, so you dress up extortion in fancy words and pretend it's about order and fairness when really it's just theft." "Enough!" Crane's hand moved toward his gun. In the split second that followed, everything happened at once. Caleb stepped in front of Eliza, his own hand on his revolver. From the barn loft, Thomas Gray chambered around with a sound that echoed like thunder. And from the bunkhouse and various positions around the property, Caleb's ranch hands appeared, each one armed and ready. The equation had changed. 12 against 1 had become 12 against 15, and suddenly Crane's men didn't look quite so confident. "Here's how this is going to work," Caleb said, his voice cold and absolute. "You're going to turn those horses around and leave my property. You're going to tell your association that I'm not interested, not now, not ever. And if you come back here threatening me or mine, you'll find out that I didn't build this ranch by backing down from bullies." "This isn't over," Crane said, but there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. "Yes, it is." Caleb's hand was steady on his gun. "Because if you start this fight, it'll end with bodies in the snow, and I guarantee some of them will be yours. Is your association worth dying for, Jackson? Is control of this territory worth bleeding out in my yard?" The standoff held for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then Crane spat into the snow and wheeled his horse around. "You're a dead man, Rourke. You just don't know it yet." "I've been a dead man before," Caleb replied. "Still here." They rode off, but Caleb knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't finished. Men like Crane didn't forgive public humiliation. They'd be back. And next time they wouldn't come with warnings and ultimatums. They'd come in the night with torches and bullets, and they'd try to destroy everything he'd built. As soon as the riders disappeared over the ridge, Eliza turned to him, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "Don't you ever step in front of me like that again," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and anger. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting. I told you I'd stand with you, and I meant it." He was going for his gun. "I know what he was doing. I've looked down the barrel of a gun before, Caleb, more than once, and I'm still here." She grabbed his shirt, pulling him close. "We do this together, or we don't do it at all. You don't get to be noble and self-sacrificing. You don't get to die for me. We survive together, or not at all." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, tasting fear and fury, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I can't lose you," he said again. "Then don't. Trust me. Fight beside me. Let me be strong instead of protected." That night they gathered in the ranch house. Caleb, Eliza, Thomas, and the senior ranch hands. They spread maps across the dining table, marking weak points in the fence line, places where fires could be set, approaches that raiders might use. "They'll come at night," Thomas said, marking positions with a stub of pencil. "Probably split into groups, some to create distractions, some to do the real damage. We need men here, here, and here." He tapped 3 points on the map. "And we need to be ready to respond fast when they hit." "How long can we hold out?" one of the hands asked. "If they keep coming, keep wearing us down." "We hold as long as we need to," Caleb said. "But we're not just going to wait for them to attack. Tomorrow, I'm riding into town. I'm going to talk to every independent rancher in the territory, everyone who's refused to join Crane's association. We're going to organize." "A counter-association?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A coalition. Mutual defense. If Crane comes after me, he comes after all of us. If he burns my barn, we burn his cattle operation to the ground." Caleb's voice was hard. "He wants to play this game. We'll play it. But we'll play to win." "That's dangerous talk," Thomas said quietly. "That's the kind of talk that starts range wars, that gets people killed." "People are already getting killed. Ranchers are already being run off their land. The only difference is whether we fight back or let it happen." Caleb looked around the table at the faces of men who'd worked with him for years, who'd trusted him through drought and blizzard and every other hardship the territory could throw at them. "I'm not asking any man to risk something he's not willing to lose. If you want to leave, draw your wages and go. No hard feelings. But I'm done running, done hiding, done letting men like Crane dictate how I live my life." None of the men moved. They looked at each other, these weathered cowboys and ranch hands who'd seen hard times and harder fights, and one by one they nodded. "I'm in," said Pete Morrison, the oldest hand, a man who'd been with Caleb since the beginning. "I've been run off land before by men like Crane. I'm too old to run again." "We're with you, boss," said another, and another, until every man at the table had committed to a fight that might cost them everything. After the meeting broke up, Caleb and Eliza stood alone in the study. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and through the window they could see the vast Montana darkness pressing against the glass. "You don't have to do this," Eliza said quietly. "You could still join the association, swallow your pride, pay their dues, keep the ranch. Is that what you want me to do?" "No." She turned to face him. "I want you to be exactly who you are, stubborn and proud and unwilling to bend. I want you to fight for what's right, even when it's hard, but I also want you to survive, and I'm scared that you can't do both." "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I'm scared that I'm leading good men into a fight that'll get them killed. I'm scared that Crane will win, that I'll lose everything I've built. But mostly I'm scared that if I back down now, I'll lose something more important than land or money or even my life." "What's that?" "Myself. The man I've worked so hard to become. The man who doesn't let fear make his decisions, who stands up for what he believes in, who builds instead of tears down." He took her hands in his. "Before you came, it was easy to risk everything because I had nothing to lose. Now I have you, I have us, and that makes every decision harder and more important." "Then let me help carry that weight," Eliza said. "Let me be part of the decision, part of the fight, part of everything. Not behind you, not protected by you, but beside you. As equals, as partners." He pulled her close, and they stood together in the firelight, two broken people who'd found something whole in each other. Outside, threats gathered and darkness waited, and the future promised nothing but uncertainty. But inside, in this moment, they had something Jackson Crane could never understand and never take away. They had chosen each other, not out of convenience or transaction or desperate need, but out of genuine connection forged in honesty and vulnerability and the courage to risk everything one more time. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and planning. Caleb rode to neighboring ranches, talking to men who'd resisted the association, building alliances one hard conversation at a time. Some agreed immediately, recognizing the threat. Others needed convincing. A few refused outright, too frightened or too cynical to believe that resistance was possible. But slowly, steadily, a coalition formed. 8 independent ranchers, their combined land holdings nearly matching the association's, their combined manpower formidable. They established communication protocols, defense strategies, mutual aid agreements. If Crane attacked one, he'd be attacking all of them. Eliza worked alongside Caleb through all of it, her mind as sharp as any lawyer's, her strategic thinking honed by years of staying one step ahead of dangers she couldn't fight directly. She saw angles he missed, anticipated moves Crane might make, helped craft agreements that protected everyone's interests while maintaining their independence. At night, they collapsed into bed exhausted, and Caleb learned what it meant to share not just his body, but his burdens with someone else. They talked through problems, challenged each other's assumptions, built plans together that neither could have created alone. And somewhere in that collaboration, in that partnership of minds and hearts, Caleb felt the last of his walls begin to crumble. 3 weeks after Crane's ultimatum, on a night when the moon was dark and the wind howled like wolves, the attack came. Fire erupted in the south pasture, bright against the darkness, and the sound of cattle stampeding filled the air. Caleb was up and moving before he was fully awake, Eliza right behind him, both of them grabbing rifles and running for the door. The ranch exploded into organized chaos. Men poured from the bunkhouse, some heading for the fire, others taking defensive positions. Thomas coordinated from the barn, his voice cutting through the confusion with clear orders. And in the midst of it all, Caleb saw riders, shadows against shadows, moving fast toward the main house. "There!" Eliza shouted, raising her rifle and firing. The shot went wide, but it had the desired effect. The riders scattered, their element of surprise broken. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Caleb dropped to one knee, returning fire with controlled precision, each shot calculated to drive the attackers back rather than kill. He didn't want deaths if he could avoid it. Dead men made martyrs, and martyrs made more enemies. But the raiders weren't showing the same restraint. Bullets slammed into the house's wooden siding, shattered windows, gouged chunks from the doorframe. One of Caleb's hands went down with a scream, clutching his leg. Another returned fire with a shotgun that lit up the night. Through the chaos, Caleb saw him, Jackson Crane, hanging back from the main fight, directing his men like a general from safety. The cowardice of it, the calculated distance between Crane and the violence he'd ordered, ignited something primal in Caleb's chest. He started moving toward Crane, Eliza matching him step for step. They advanced through the darkness, using cover, moving like they'd been fighting together for years instead of weeks. And when they were close enough, when Crane's escape route was cut off, Caleb stood and leveled his rifle at the man's chest. "It's over, Jackson," he said, his voice carrying despite the gunfire. "Call off your men or I'll drop you where you sit." Crane's hand moved toward his gun, and Eliza's rifle cracked. The bullet took Crane's hat clean off his head, a miss calculated to the inch. "Next one goes between your eyes," she said calmly. "Your choice." For a long moment, Crane stared at them both, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Then he raised his hand and his voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down! Everyone stand down!" The gunfire sputtered and died. In the sudden silence, broken only by the crackling of fire and the heavy breathing of exhausted men, the two sides faced each other across the torn ground of Caleb's ranch. "You've made your point," Crane said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "But this isn't finished." "Yes," Caleb said quietly, "it is. Because tomorrow morning, 8 ranch owners are riding to the territorial marshal. We're filing formal complaints, documenting tonight's raid, presenting evidence of extortion and intimidation and arson. Your association is finished, Jackson, and if you're smart, you'll disappear before the law catches up with you. The law doesn't reach out here. Maybe not, but 8 unified ranches do, and we're done being divided." Caleb lowered his rifle slightly, though his aim never wavered. "You wanted control. You wanted to build a monopoly through fear, but you forgot something. The frontier doesn't belong to bullies. It belongs to people stubborn enough to fight for it." Crane's hand twitched toward his gun one more time, and this time it was Caleb who fired. The bullet struck the ground 6 inches from Crane's horse, making the animal rear. When it came down, Crane had both hands visible, empty, raised. "Get off my land," Caleb said, "and if I see you or any of your men within 5 miles of my property again, I won't miss." They left in defeat, and Caleb watched them go with a satisfaction that felt hollow. The ranch was damaged, fence destroyed, pasture burned, 1 man wounded and 3 others sporting minor injuries. The cost had been high. But they'd stood their ground. They'd won. As dawn broke over the Montana horizon, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, Caleb stood with Eliza surveying the damage. Smoke still rose from the burned pasture. The house bore scars that would take weeks to repair, but they were still standing, still together. "We did it," Eliza said softly, leaning against him. "We survived," Caleb corrected. "That's not the same as winning. Oh, it is when you're fighting for the right to exist on your own terms." She turned to look at him, and her eyes held exhaustion and triumph in equal measure. "You stood up to them, we stood up to them, and we're still here." He kissed her then, tasting smoke and gunpowder and the salt of her sweat, and it was the sweetest kiss of his life. Because it was a kiss earned through fire and fear, and the choice to stand together when running would have been easier. "Marry me," he said against her mouth, the words surprising him as much as her. She pulled back, studying his face. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious about anything." He took her hands, and they were both shaking. "I know it's fast, I know it's probably crazy, but I also know that you're the strongest, bravest, most honest person I've ever met. And I don't want to waste another day pretending I don't need you. I don't want to wait for the right moment or the perfect circumstances. I want to face whatever comes next with you as my partner, my wife, my equal in everything." Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the soot that smudged her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you stubborn, impossible, wonderful man. I'll marry you." And there, in the wreckage of a battle they'd survived together, surrounded by the evidence of what they were willing to risk for each other, they began building something neither had believed possible. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, but a partnership forged in fire and honesty and the courage to choose love over fear. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, not in a grand ceremony that would have satisfied the social climbing families who'd once courted Caleb's wealth, but in a simple gathering that felt more like a declaration of war won than a romantic celebration. The territorial judge rode out from Helena, a gruff man named Emmett Doyle, who'd built his reputation on being incorruptible in a land where corruption was the common currency. He stood in Caleb's study, the same room where this whole improbable story had begun, and married them with words that were brief and unadorned. "Do you, Caleb Rourke, take this woman as your wife, to stand with her through whatever hardships this territory throws at you?" "I do," Caleb said, and the words felt like the easiest truth he'd ever spoken. "Do you, Eliza Hart, take this man as your husband, knowing full well he's stubborn as granite and twice as hard to move?" Eliza's laugh was pure and genuine. I do. I absolutely do. Then, by the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you married. You can kiss her now, Rourke, before she changes her mind. The kiss they shared was witnessed by Thomas Gray, Margaret the cook, the ranch hands who'd fought beside them, and the 7 ranchers who'd formed the coalition that had ultimately broken Jackson Crane's association. It was a kiss that tasted like victory and promise, and the kind of hope that came from surviving something that should have destroyed you. But even as they celebrated with whiskey and a meal that Margaret had spent 3 days preparing, Caleb knew the real challenges were just beginning. Crane had disappeared after the raid, but disappearing wasn't the same as defeated. The association had fractured, its members scattering to protect their own interests. But the ideology behind it, the belief that strength came from control and consolidation, hadn't died with the organization. You're thinking too much, Eliza said that night, as they lay together in bed, the house finally quiet after hours of celebration. I can feel your mind spinning from here. I'm thinking about what comes next, Caleb admitted. We won the battle, but that doesn't mean we've won the war. Crane's out there somewhere, probably planning his next move. The other ranchers in our coalition are looking to me for leadership, and I don't know if I'm the right man for that. And now we're married, which means you're not alone anymore, Eliza interrupted, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. You don't have to carry everything yourself. That's what partnership means, remember? We face things together. I'm not used to that. I know. 12 years is a long time to be alone. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, gentle and sure. But you're not that man anymore. You're not the fortress that no one can reach. You're my husband. And whether you like it or not, that means I get a say in the decisions that affect our future. Our future, he repeated, testing the words. I like the sound of that. Good. Because tomorrow we're riding into town, and we're going to start building it. The next morning brought a clarity that felt almost cruel in its precision. The damage from Crane's raid was extensive but repairable. Fences could be rebuilt, pastures would recover, the house could be patched. But the psychological damage to the territory ran deeper. Fear had taken root in the hearts of honest ranchers who'd watched Crane's association brutalize those who resisted. Even with the association broken, that fear remained, a poison that would take time and effort to extract. Caleb and Eliza rode into town together, and if there were raised eyebrows at the sight of a rancher's new wife wearing practical riding clothes instead of the elaborate dresses expected of wealthy women, no one was foolish enough to comment within earshot. They stopped first at the general store, where Eliza placed orders for supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd managed tighter budgets than most people could imagine. You're good at this, Caleb observed, watching her negotiate prices with a skill that bordered on artistry. I've been poor, she said simply. You never forget how to stretch a dollar once you've learned. From the general store, they went to the land office, where Caleb filed the paperwork that would officially record the mutual defense agreements between the coalition ranches. The clerk, a nervous man named Paulson, handled the documents with shaking hands. Mr. Rourke, I have to tell you, there are people who aren't happy about this coalition of yours. They're saying you're trying to build your own version of what Crane had. Let them say it, Caleb replied. The difference is we're not forcing anyone to join. We're not threatening anyone who refuses. We're just agreeing to help each other when times get hard. That used to be called neighborliness. Still, Paulson lowered his voice, you might want to watch your back. Crane had friends, and some of them are still around. The warning proved prophetic 3 days later when Thomas Gray found fresh tracks on the northern boundary of the ranch. 5 riders, moving slow and deliberate, surveying the land like wolves studying prey. The tracks disappeared into the hills, but their message was clear. Someone was watching. Someone was planning. We should set patrols, but Thomas said that evening in the study. Double the watch on the livestock. Keep men positioned at the vulnerable points. That's defensive thinking, Eliza said from her chair by the fire. Both men turned to look at her, and she met their gazes without flinching. Defensive thinking is reactive. It means we're always responding to their moves instead of making our own. What are you suggesting? Caleb asked. I'm suggesting we find out who's watching us and why. I'm suggesting we take the fight to them before they bring it to us. She set down the book she'd been reading. You know this territory better than anyone, Caleb. You know where someone would camp if they were planning another raid, so let's go find them." "That's risky," Thomas said. "If they catch you out in the open—" "They won't," Eliza cut in, "because they won't be expecting us to come looking. They're expecting us to huddle here and wait for the next attack like scared rabbits." Caleb studied his wife, this woman who'd survived 13 years of running and somehow emerged with her courage not just intact, but refined to a razor's edge. "You're talking about tracking them, finding their camp. What then?" "Then we give them a choice. Leave the territory or face every rancher in the coalition. We make it clear that the cost of continuing this fight is higher than any potential gain." She leaned forward. "You broke Crane's association by standing up to him. Now you break what's left of his influence by showing his followers that there's no profit in revenge." It was bold. It was dangerous. And it was exactly the kind of move that could end this for good or get them both killed. "I'll go," Caleb said. "But you're staying here." "The hell I am." "Eliza, we're partners, remember? That means I don't sit home while you ride into danger. It means we face things together." The steel in her voice was unmistakable. "You want to leave me behind, you'll have to tie me up. And even then, I'll probably find a way to follow you." Thomas Gray made a sound that might have been a laugh or a groan. "You two deserve each other. Stubborn doesn't begin to cover it." They left before dawn 2 days later, just Caleb and Eliza and Thomas, moving light and fast into the hill country north of the ranch. The tracks were old but readable. 5 riders who'd made camp in a box canyon that offered protection from 3 sides and a clear view of anyone approaching from the 4th. It took them 6 hours to circle around and come in from above, moving through terrain so rough that the horses had to be left a mile back. They crawled the last 100 yards on their bellies, the frozen ground soaking through their clothes, until they could look down into the canyon. 5 men sat around a fire, and Caleb recognized 2 of them immediately. One was Samuel Brennan, whose family had used Miranda's information to nearly destroy Caleb 12 years ago. The other was a hired gun named Cole Masterson, a man with a reputation for solving problems with bullets and asking questions never. "Brennan," Caleb breathed, and beside him Eliza's hand found his, squeezing hard. "The man who bought your wife's betrayal?" "The same." Old rage burned in Caleb's chest, but it was colder now, more controlled. "He's been waiting 12 years for another chance to finish what Miranda started." They watched and listened as the men below discussed their plans. Another raid, timed for the spring when Caleb would be moving cattle to summer pasture. They talked about it casually, like they were planning a hunting trip instead of arson and murder. And they talked about Eliza, speculation about what Caleb's new wife would fetch if they took her, how much leverage a woman could provide. Caleb felt Eliza go rigid beside him, felt her breathing change from calm to controlled fury. "We could shoot them from here," she whispered. "End this right now." "We could," Caleb agreed. "But then we'd be no better than they are. And we'd never know who else is involved, who else might come after us. Then what?" "Then we do what you suggested. We give them a choice." They worked their way back down the canyon wall and around to the entrance, moving slowly and carefully. When they were in position, Caleb stood up from behind a boulder and fired a single shot that kicked up snow 3 feet from the campfire. The men below scrambled for their weapons, but Thomas's voice from another position froze them. "First man who draws gets a bullet from up here. Second man gets one from over there. Third man, well, you see how this goes." Caleb walked into the canyon, rifle held ready, Eliza flanking him with her own weapon. At close range, he could see the recognition dawn in Samuel Brennan's face. "Rourke," Brennan said, and there was something like satisfaction in his voice. "Wondered when you'd figure it out." "Wondered when you'd get tired of waiting," Caleb replied. 12 years is a long time to hold a grudge, Samuel." "Not when the grudge is justified." Brennan's hand hovered near his revolver. "You humiliated my family. Used your ranch to block our expansion. Drove our prices down with your cheap cattle. You've been a thorn in our side since the day you arrived in this territory." "I competed fairly. That's not the same as sabotage." "Fair?" Brennan laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think there's anything fair about the frontier? You think Miranda saw it that way when you abandoned her for your precious ranch?" The words hit like a physical blow. "Abandoned her? She stole from me. She sold me out to you and your brothers. She left me broke. And she left you? Brennan's expression shifted to something like confusion. Is that what you think happened? I know what happened. I lived it. You know half of it. Brennan spat into the fire. Miranda came to us because you were suffocating her with your ambition. Every penny went back into the ranch. Every decision was about growth and expansion and building your empire. She was supposed to be your partner, but you treated her like an employee. So yes, she gave us information. Yes, she took money. But she didn't run away with some railroad man, Rourke. She ran from you. The words hung in the frozen air, and Caleb felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the past. He'd spent 12 years believing he was the victim of calculated betrayal, never considering that Miranda might have seen herself the same way. That doesn't justify what she did, Eliza said quietly, and Caleb felt a surge of gratitude for her presence, her clear-eyed refusal to let him drown in this revelation. No, Brennan agreed. It doesn't. But it explains it, and it explains why we're here now, because Rourke built his empire on the bones of people he used and discarded, and someone needs to hold him accountable. Is that what this is? Caleb asked, finding his voice again. Accountability? Or just revenge dressed up in noble clothes? Does it matter? It does to me. Caleb took a breath, feeling Eliza's steady presence beside him, feeling the weight of 12 years of assumptions crumbling. You're right about one thing. I was so focused on building something that lasted that I forgot to see the people building it with me. I treated Miranda like a tool instead of a partner, and she hurt me in response, and I let that hurt turn me into someone even worse. He looked at Brennan directly. But I'm not that man anymore. I've learned what partnership actually means, what trust actually requires. And I'm telling you now, this ends here. You can keep nursing your grudge, keep planning raids and revenge, and eventually you'll succeed in destroying me, or I'll succeed in destroying you. Or you can let it go. Take your men and leave the territory. Start somewhere else. Build something new. Stop letting the past poison your future. Oh, you think it's that simple? Brennan's laugh was hollow. You think I can just walk away from 12 years of... I think you can choose, Caleb interrupted. Same way I'm choosing right now. I could kill you, all of you. Thomas has a clean shot at anyone who moves wrong, and Eliza's proved she can shoot the wings off a fly. We have the advantage, the justification, and the will. But I'm choosing not to. I'm choosing to offer you the same thing I wished someone had offered me 12 years ago. A chance to walk away and build something better. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind whistling through the canyon. Cole Masterson shifted slightly, and Thomas's rifle tracked the movement with professional precision. Finally, Brennan spoke, his voice tired and old. What guarantee do I have that you won't come after us the minute we leave? My word, Caleb said simply, which is worth more than any contract or legal document in this territory. You leave peacefully, you don't come back, you don't make more trouble, and I'll forget I ever found you here. You'll have safe passage to the territorial border and enough time to get your affairs in order. And if I don't take your offer, then we end this right here, right now. And only one of us walks out of this canyon. Caleb's voice was steady, final. Your choice, Samuel. The standoff held for what felt like an eternity. Then Brennan's shoulders sagged, and something like relief crossed his face. The relief of a man who'd been carrying a burden too long and finally had permission to set it down. All right, he said quietly. All right, we'll go. They watched Brennan and his men pack up their camp and ride south, disappearing into the vastness of the Montana landscape. Thomas stayed behind to ensure they actually left the territory, while Caleb and Eliza made their way back to the ranch. They rode in silence for a long time, both processing what had happened, what had been revealed. Finally, as the ranch buildings came into view in the distance, Eliza spoke. Are you all right? I don't know, Caleb admitted. I spent 12 years hating Miranda for what she did, built my entire philosophy around that betrayal, and now I find out that I drove her to it. You didn't drive her to steal and lie, Eliza said firmly. She made her own choices, but you're right that you weren't innocent in creating the situation that led to those choices. How do I live with that? The same way I live with the fact that I stayed with Robert for 5 years instead of leaving after the first time he hit me. The same way I live with every decision I made that I wish I could take back. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. You acknowledge it. You learn from it. You become someone better, and you stop letting the past define your future. Is that what you've done? It's what I'm trying to do every single day. She smiled, and it was sad and genuine and beautiful all at once. It's what we're doing together. The months that followed brought changes that transformed not just the ranch, but the entire territory. The coalition of independent ranchers grew stronger, adding new members who'd been watching from the sidelines, waiting to see if resistance was possible. They established fair trading practices, mutual aid agreements, and a democratic process for resolving disputes that didn't involve bullets or intimidation. Caleb found himself in a leadership role he'd never sought but couldn't avoid. Ranchers came to him for advice, for mediation, for the kind of steady judgment that came from surviving everything the frontier could throw at you and coming out stronger. And always, Eliza was beside him, not behind him, not following in his shadow, but as a true partner whose insights and strategies were as valuable as his own. She transformed the ranch house from a mausoleum into a home, not through elaborate renovations, but through the simple act of living in it fully. Books appeared on tables, conversation filled the dining room, laughter echoed through hallways that had been silent for too long. She started a small school for the children of ranch families, teaching reading and arithmetic in the front room 3 days a week. She organized gatherings that brought isolated families together, building community in a place that had known only competition. And slowly, carefully, Caleb learned to trust again. Not the blind trust he'd given Miranda, the kind that expected perfection and collapsed at the first betrayal, but something deeper and more resilient, the trust that came from seeing someone's flaws and loving them anyway, from building something together one difficult conversation at a time, from choosing partnership even when solitude would be easier. Spring came late that year, the snow clinging to the high valleys well into May. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that felt almost miraculous. The burned pasture from Crane's raid exploded with new grass, greener and thicker than before. The cattle that had scattered during the attack had been rounded up, and the herd was stronger for having survived the winter. And throughout the territory, honest ranchers were thriving in ways that would have been impossible under Crane's association. On a morning when the world seemed impossibly bright and new, Caleb found Eliza in the barn, brushing down her horse with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the stall door. "That's always dangerous," she replied without looking up, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "About what you said, about building something better, about not letting the past define the future. And I want to expand the school, build a proper building, hire more teachers, make it available to every child in the territory, regardless of whether their family can afford to pay." He paused. "I want to use what I've built, the money, the influence, the land, to create something that outlasts me. Something that makes this place better for the people who come after." Now she did look up, her amber eyes bright with unshed tears. "Caleb Rourke, are you going soft on me?" "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I'm finally figuring out what strength actually means. It's not about building walls or standing alone or refusing to need anyone. It's about choosing to be vulnerable enough to care, choosing to invest in things that might fail, choosing to trust that the future can be better than the past." She set down the brush and crossed to him, her work-roughened hands framing his face. "I love you," she said simply. "Not for what you were or what you might become, but for exactly who you are right now. A stubborn, philosophical, deeply good man who's finally learning that he doesn't have to carry the world alone." "I love you too," he said, and the words came easier every time. "Thank you for being patient with me while I figured that out." Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. They broke apart to see a rider approaching, a young man Caleb didn't recognize, wearing the dust of hard travel. "Mr. Rourke?" the rider called. "I have a message from the territorial governor. He'd like to meet with you and Helena. Something about the coalition you've organized and how it might serve as a model for other parts of the territory." Caleb and Eliza exchanged glances, and he saw his own surprise reflected in her eyes. What had started as simple self-defense had grown into something larger, something that might actually change how people organized and governed themselves on the frontier. "Tell the governor I'll come," Caleb said. "But not alone. My wife and I make decisions together, If he wants to talk about the coalition, he talks to both of us. The writer nodded and accepted the water and food that Eliza offered before riding off to carry Caleb's response back to Helena. The territorial governor, Eliza said, shaking her head in wonder. You know what this means? That we're in way over our heads? That what we built here matters? That standing up to Crane didn't just save your ranch, it started something bigger. She took his hand. We started something bigger. The trip to Helena took 3 days through spring mud and swollen rivers. They traveled with Thomas Gray and 2 other ranchers from the coalition, a delegation that represented not just Caleb's interests, but the collective voice of independent operators who'd found strength in cooperation. Governor Benjamin Wade received them in his office, a surprisingly modest room that smelled of tobacco and old leather. He was a big man with shrewd eyes and a handlebar mustache that would have looked ridiculous on anyone less formidable. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke, he greeted them, gesturing to chairs. Thank you for coming. I've been hearing remarkable things about what you've accomplished in the North Country. We've just been trying to survive, Governor, Caleb said carefully. Survival is underestimated, Wade replied. Most people don't realize how much courage it takes, how much vision, but what you've done goes beyond survival. You've created a functional system of governance in an area that everyone assumed was ungovernable. You've proven that cooperation works better than coercion, that voluntary association is stronger than forced consolidation. He leaned forward, his expression intense. I want to support what you're building. Official recognition, legal standing, maybe even funding for infrastructure and education. But I need to understand how it works, how you've managed to get stubborn, independent ranchers to work together when every other attempt has failed. Eliza spoke before Caleb could. We gave them a choice, Governor. We didn't force anyone to join. We didn't threaten anyone who refused. We just offered mutual aid to those who wanted it, and we proved that it worked by surviving things that should have destroyed us individually. And when disputes arise, when interests conflict, we talk, Caleb said. We have a council made up of representatives from each ranch. Everyone gets a voice. Decisions are made by consensus when possible, by majority vote when necessary. And everyone agrees to abide by those decisions, not because they're forced to, but because they've seen that the alternative is chaos. Wade studied them both for a long moment. You realize what you've created, don't you? It's a functioning democracy on a small scale. It's exactly the kind of self-governance that the territory needs if we're ever going to achieve statehood. We're not politicians, Governor, Caleb said. We're just trying to run our ranches and keep our families safe. The best leaders usually are, Wade replied. The ones who seek power for its own sake are precisely the ones who shouldn't have it. But the ones who lead because circumstances demand it, because they see problems that need solving, those are the ones who actually make a difference. He stood, moving to a map on the wall that showed the entire Montana territory. I want to propose something. I want your coalition to serve as a pilot program for local governance. I'll provide official backing, legal authority to resolve disputes, and enforce basic laws. In return, you document what works and what doesn't. You show me, and the rest of the territory, that ordinary people can govern themselves without descending into violence and chaos. And if we fail? Eliza asked. Then we learn from the failure and try something else, Wade said. But I don't think you'll fail. You've already succeeded against longer odds. They accepted the governor's proposal, and over the next year the coalition transformed from an informal mutual aid agreement into something approaching real local government. They built a courthouse in the town nearest Caleb's ranch, established processes for resolving disputes and recording property transfers, and created a system of rotating leadership that ensured no single person held power indefinitely. Caleb served his turn as chairman, making decisions he never imagined he'd have to make, learning to balance competing interests and navigate the messy reality of democratic governance. And through it all, Eliza was beside him, sometimes supporting his decisions, sometimes challenging them, always pushing him to think beyond his own perspective and consider the broader implications of every choice. The school they dreamed of became a reality, a solid building with glass windows and real desks, staffed by 3 teachers including Eliza herself. Children came from ranches 50 miles away, boarding during the week with local families, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but the skills they'd need to build lives of meaning and purpose. And somewhere in the midst of all this building and growing and learning, Caleb realized that the empire he'd spent 12 years constructing, the land and cattle and money, mattered far less than what he'd built with Eliza. The trust, the partnership, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. On their first anniversary, he took her to the ridge that overlooked the ranch, the same place where he'd stood alone so many times watching storms approach. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" he asked as they watched the sun set over the mountains. "About love being a risk? About choosing to face life beside someone instead of alone?" "I remember," she said, leaning against him. "I thought you were crazy. I thought love was just another word for vulnerability. And vulnerability was suicide." He turned to look at her, this woman who'd crashed into his carefully ordered world and demolished every certainty he'd clung to. "But you were right. Love is a risk, and it's the only risk worth taking. Are you getting philosophical on our anniversary?" "I'm getting honest." He took her hands in his. "Before you, I had everything and nothing. I had land and money and power, but I was slowly dying of loneliness and didn't even realize it. You gave me something worth more than all of that combined. You gave me a reason to be vulnerable, a reason to trust, a reason to believe that the future could be better than the past. You gave me the same thing," she said softly. "For 13 years, I ran from everything, from pain, from risk, from the possibility of being hurt again. And then I met a stubborn rancher who was running in exactly the same direction, and somehow we both found the courage to stop running and start building instead." They stood together as darkness fell, watching the lights come on in the ranch house below, the home they'd made together, the life they'd chosen together, the future they were building one difficult, beautiful day at a time. The Montana frontier was still harsh. Winters were still brutal. Drought and disease and 1,000 other hardships still threatened everything they'd built. But they faced those hardships together, and that made all the difference. Caleb Rourke had spent 12 years as a fortress, impregnable and alone, wealthy beyond measure, and poor in every way that mattered. But standing on that ridge with Eliza's hand in his, watching the empire they were building together, an empire of trust and community and genuine partnership, he understood at last what true strength meant. It wasn't the ability to stand alone. It was the courage to stand together. It wasn't building walls to keep the world out. It was opening doors to let the right people in. It wasn't refusing to need anyone. It was choosing to need someone and trusting them enough to show that need without shame. Years later, when asked about the secret to the coalition's success, Caleb would tell a story about a bitter morning when a quiet woman rode alone to his gate and offered him something no one else had: honest conversation and the willingness to risk everything on the possibility that two broken people might build something whole together. "That's where it started," he would say, "not with strategy or politics or careful planning, but with two people tired of being alone, brave enough to try something different, and stubborn enough to keep choosing each other even when it would have been easier to quit." And beside him, Eliza would smile that small, genuine smile that had first captured his heart. And she would add, "Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to face the imperfect world beside you, someone who sees your scars and doesn't flinch, someone who trusts you enough to show their own." The frontier would continue to test them. Challenges would come that they couldn't anticipate, but they would face those challenges the same way they'd faced everything else, together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd learned that the greatest strength wasn't standing alone at the top of an empire. It was standing together in the middle of a life being built, stone by stone, choice by choice, day by difficult and beautiful day. And in that standing together, they found something that all Caleb's wealth and all Eliza's survival skills could never have achieved alone. They found home. They found purpose. They found the kind of love that wasn't a fairy tale or a transaction, but a daily choice to see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. And the empire that had once felt so empty became full, not with possessions or power, but with the presence of someone who mattered, someone worth fighting for, someone worth being vulnerable for. The iron heart of Montana had finally learned to beat. Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. They broke apart to see a rider approaching, a young man Caleb didn't recognize, wearing the dust of hard travel. "Mr. Rourke," the rider called, "I have a message from the territorial governor. He'd like to meet with you and Helena. Something about the coalition you've organized and how it might serve as a model for other parts of the territory. Caleb and Eliza exchanged glances, and he saw his own surprise reflected in her eyes. What had started as simple self-defense had grown into something larger, something that might actually change how people organized and governed themselves on the frontier. "Tell the governor I'll come," Caleb said, "but not alone. My wife and I make decisions together. If he wants to talk about the coalition, he talks to both of us." The writer nodded and accepted the water and food that Eliza offered before riding off to carry Caleb's response back to Helena. "The territorial governor," Eliza said, shaking her head in wonder. "You know what this means? That we're in way over our heads? That what we built here matters? That standing up to Crane didn't just save your ranch, it started something bigger." She took his hand. "We started something bigger." The trip to Helena took 3 days through spring mud and swollen rivers. They traveled with Thomas Gray and 2 other ranchers from the coalition, a delegation that represented not just Caleb's interests, but the collective voice of independent operators who'd found strength in cooperation. Governor Benjamin Wade received them in his office, a surprisingly modest room that smelled of tobacco and old leather. He was a big man with shrewd eyes and a handlebar mustache that would have looked ridiculous on anyone less formidable. "Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke," he greeted them, gesturing to chairs. "Thank you for coming. I've been hearing remarkable things about what you've accomplished in the North Country." "We've just been trying to survive, Governor," Caleb said carefully. "Survival is underestimated," Wade replied. "Most people don't realize how much courage it takes, how much vision. But what you've done goes beyond survival. You've created a functional system of governance in an area that everyone assumed was ungovernable. You've proven that cooperation works better than coercion, that voluntary association is stronger than forced consolidation." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "I want to support what you're building. Official recognition, legal standing, maybe even funding for infrastructure and education. But I need to understand how it works. How you've managed to get stubborn, independent ranchers to work together when every other attempt has failed." Eliza spoke before Caleb could. "We gave them a choice, Governor. We didn't force anyone to join. We didn't threaten anyone who refused. We just offered mutual aid to those who wanted it, and we proved that it worked by surviving things that should have destroyed us individually. And when disputes arise, when interests conflict, we talk," Caleb said. "We have a council made up of representatives from each ranch. Everyone gets a voice. Decisions are made by consensus when possible, by majority vote when necessary, and everyone agrees to abide by those decisions, not because they're forced to, but because they've seen that the alternative is chaos." Wade studied them both for a long moment. "You realize what you've created, don't you? It's a functioning democracy on a small scale. It's exactly the kind of self-governance that the territory needs if we're ever going to achieve statehood." "We're not politicians, Governor," Caleb said. "We're just trying to run our ranches and keep our families safe." "The best leaders usually are," Wade replied. "The ones who seek power for its own sake are precisely the ones who shouldn't have it. But the ones who lead because circumstances demand it, because they see problems that need solving, those are the ones who actually make a difference." He stood, moving to a map on the wall that showed the entire Montana territory. "I want to propose something. I want your coalition to serve as a pilot program for local governance. I'll provide official backing, legal authority to resolve disputes and enforce basic laws. In return, you document what works and what doesn't. You show me, and the rest of the territory, that ordinary people can govern themselves without descending into violence and chaos." "And if we fail?" Eliza asked. "Then we learn from the failure and try something else," Wade said. "But I don't think you'll fail. You've already succeeded against longer odds." They accepted the governor's proposal, and over the next year, the coalition transformed from an informal mutual aid agreement into something approaching real local government. They built a courthouse in the town nearest Caleb's ranch, established processes for resolving disputes and recording property transfers, and created a system of rotating leadership that ensured no single person held power indefinitely. Caleb served his turn as chairman, making decisions he never imagined he'd have to make, learning to balance competing interests and navigate the messy reality of democratic governance. And through it all, Eliza was beside him, sometimes supporting his decisions, sometimes challenging them, always pushing him to think beyond his own perspective and consider the broader implications of every choice. The school they dreamed of became a reality, a solid building with glass windows and real desks, staffed by 3 teachers including Eliza herself. Children came from ranches 50 miles away, boarding during the week with local families, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but the skills they'd need to build lives of meaning and purpose. And somewhere in the midst of all this building and growing and learning, Caleb realized that the empire he'd spent 12 years constructing, the land and cattle and money, mattered far less than what he'd built with Eliza. The trust, the partnership, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. On their first anniversary, he took her to the ridge that overlooked the ranch, the same place where he'd stood alone so many times watching storms approach. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" he asked as they watched the sun set over the mountains. "About love being a risk? About choosing to face life beside someone instead of alone?" "I remember," she said, leaning against him. "I thought you were crazy. I thought love was just another word for vulnerability, and vulnerability was suicide." He turned to look at her, this woman who'd crashed into his carefully ordered world and demolished every certainty he'd clung to. "But you were right. Love is a risk, and it's the only risk worth taking. Are you getting philosophical on our anniversary?" "I'm getting honest." He took her hands in his. "Before you, I had everything and nothing. I had land and money and power, but I was slowly dying of loneliness and didn't even realize it. You gave me something worth more than all of that combined. You gave me a reason to be vulnerable, a reason to trust, a reason to believe that the future could be better than the past." "You gave me the same thing," she said softly. "For 13 years I ran from everything, from pain, from risk, from the possibility of being hurt again. And then I met a stubborn rancher who was running in exactly the same direction, and somehow we both found the courage to stop running and start building instead." They stood together as darkness fell, watching the lights come on in the ranch house below, the home they'd made together, the life they'd chosen together, the future they were building one difficult, beautiful day at a time. The Montana frontier was still harsh. Winters were still brutal. Drought and disease and 1,000 other hardships still threatened everything they'd built. But they faced those hardships together, and that made all the difference. Caleb Rourke had spent 12 years as a fortress, impregnable and alone, wealthy beyond measure and poor in every way that mattered. But standing on that ridge with Eliza's hand in his, watching the empire they were building together, an empire of trust and community and genuine partnership, he understood at last what true strength meant. It wasn't the ability to stand alone. It was the courage to stand together. It wasn't building walls to keep the world out. It was opening doors to let the right people in. It wasn't refusing to need anyone. It was choosing to need someone and trusting them enough to show that need without shame. Years later, when asked about the secret to the coalition's success, Caleb would tell a story about a bitter morning when a quiet woman rode alone to his gate and offered him something no one else had. Honest conversation and the willingness to risk everything on the possibility that 2 broken people might build something whole together. "That's where it started," he would say, not with strategy or politics or careful planning, but with 2 people tired of being alone, brave enough to try something different, and stubborn enough to keep choosing each other even when it would have been easier to quit. And beside him, Eliza would smile that small, genuine smile that had first captured his heart, and she would add, "Love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to face the imperfect world beside you, someone who sees your scars and doesn't flinch, someone who trusts you enough to show their own." The frontier would continue to test them. Challenges would come that they couldn't anticipate. But they would face those challenges the same way they'd faced everything else, together, as partners, as equals, as 2 people who'd learned that the greatest strength wasn't standing alone at the top of an empire. It was standing together in the middle of a life being built, stone by stone, choice by choice, day by difficult and beautiful day. And in that standing together, they found something that all Caleb's wealth and all Eliza's survival skills could never have achieved alone. They found home. They found purpose. They found the kind of love that wasn't a fairy tale or a transaction, but a daily choice to see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. And the empire that had once felt so empty became full, not with possessions or power, but with the presence of someone who mattered, someone worth fighting for, someone worth being vulnerable for. The iron heart of Montana had finally learned to beat,